Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We've got a record turnout for this webinar on making the best use of downtime. Downtime which has been forced upon us due to the COVID-19 lockdown and social restrictions, which have led most sporting organisations across the country having to put their operations on hold. This session is the fourth in our Club Crisis Management series, which we're hosting as part of our ongoing support for the sport, recreation and not-for-profit sectors in Australia. And the session follows previous webinars on building club resilience, safely shutting down your club due to the coronavirus crisis, and running successful online meetings, a topic close to our heart given that we are self-professed nerds. If you missed these past webinars, recordings of them are available from our website on the webinars tab. Very easy to access. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to touch base with us using the contact tab on our website also. My name is Steve. That's a particularly cheery photo of me that I had a chuckle at last week when Michael showed that. I'm the director of CPR Group's sport and community development team. Over the past 15 odd years, I've thoroughly enjoyed working with all types of sport, recreation and community organisations to help them run better businesses and to help their volunteers become happier in their roles. And when asked why I do this job, the answer is quite easy. And the answer is that I live for those aha moments. When I see it dawn on someone's face that they've just discovered a way to enjoy their volunteer involvement a little more, I feel as though my work there is done. Joining me today is Kate Gordon, one of our wonderful consultants at CPR Group. Kate will act as the moderator for the webinar, and I will briefly hand over to Kate now and she'll explain how you can ask questions during the session. Kate.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. So we'll go through the webinar presented by Steve, and if you guys have any questions along the way, you can ask those by clicking on the Q&A tab within this webinar. They will come through to us. You won't be able to see all of the questions that have been asked, but we'll get your questions and we'll go through those at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have time to get to your question, we'll definitely get in touch with you tomorrow and have a chat to you and get those answered for you.
Thank you very much, Kate. So we figured that tonight's session is probably a really good opportunity to reflect on the need through this forced downtime to stay positive. Mindset is something that we discuss quite a lot at CPR Group and in the work that we do with volunteer organisations. And our team at CPR Group realised pretty early that this COVID-19 situation was going to have a massive impact on our lives at home, at work, obviously schools, and importantly in our clubs. But we didn't drop our heads in our hands. We didn't concern ourselves with lots of negative what ifs like we could have done. Instead, led really by Michael Connelly, our managing director, we spoke really positively about potential opportunities that exist during and on the other side of this crisis right from the outset. And this included discussions regarding which of those internal admin tasks that have been dropping off the bottom of all of our lists for years we might now be able to get done. Things like updating templates and reviewing policies, including our working from home policy, which was about to become a whole lot more important. But our discussions also focused on the fact that significant opportunities were going to arise through this crisis, opportunities that could have a lasting positive impact on our ability to work with more and more clients on a wider range of exciting projects. And so whilst this is certainly not to put to the side the human tragedy associated with the coronavirus crisis, which we do acknowledge. The reality is that the impacts are far broader than just the human tragedy, and obviously impacting our economies around the world. Societies around the world are reeling from being told to stay home. Funnily enough, my wife is a real homebody, and just the other day she said, I'm really sick of staying home. So if she's saying that, everybody must be getting a little bit stir crazy. So it is really important, like I say, for us to focus on mindset. And inevitably, there are going to be companies, as well as sporting clubs and associations, that emerge from this period of forced downtime stronger and with a greater degree of market share than they've ever enjoyed before. I'm sure that in time to come, there'll be fingers pointed at some of these successful organisations, along with comments like, oh, aren't they lucky? Look how well they're doing now. Coronavirus was the best thing that could have happened to them. But it's important to remember that luck is simply where preparation meets opportunity. It's up to us to create our own good luck. So now is the time to do the preparation necessary so that your organisations can be lucky when recovery opportunities start to present themselves. And we reckon that those clubs that use their downtime wisely are going to produce our sports industry's future success stories. Now, I'm going to cover a bit of an elephant in the room now, in the proverbial room, that is, the digital webinar room. Quite early in this crisis, around mid-March, gosh, that's not actually that long ago, but feels like a lifetime already, we were seeing news articles focusing on the fact that sport in Australia was facing catastrophic impacts. At the top level, major football code seasons were gradually being postponed, having only just begun. Obviously, with no sport televised, this placed broadcast revenue in jeopardy. And in the case of the AFL and NRL, for example, this forms a major proportion of their total income as sporting codes. Many national football clubs were finding themselves in a similar boat in that they largely rely on income from fans and sponsors and corporate partners, income that's dried up in the wake of stadium sport, so to speak, not taking place. And I'm focusing on AFL and NRL here, but really this is representative, and the same situation has been seen across the full gamut of our professional sporting landscape. And as you are all very well aware, grassroots sport is feeling the impact too. So at the time, at the same time we've been reading about national sporting codes facing financial ruin, we're also hearing stories from sports clubs who will be sent to the wall or forced to shut down due to a season of no sport, or even less than a season, given that we're still likely working towards some kind of contracted winter sporting season here in Australia. But I've got a real concern that these clubs that are telling themselves that things won't be okay, or our people won't come back, or our money won't come back, are heading straight for a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're convincing themselves that this is the end. Now, don't get me wrong, every day we get a kick out of helping all sorts of sport, recreation and community organisations, as I explained earlier, to improve their business operations and become off-field champions. We truly love helping volunteers to be happier in their roles. Some clubs with which we work are already thriving. They're increasing turnover. They're adding new revenue streams and recruiting and retaining more players than ever. And they might just want some support to take their operations to the next level and maybe implement some systems to ensure that future committees can continue to be just as successful as they are today. But some clubs are in real strife, and the current committee may have taken on the problems of terrible decisions made by previous committees, and that current group of people might be doing their darndest to get things back on track. So I am aware, and we at CPR Group are abundantly aware, that if clubs out there didn't need support, we wouldn't have a job. So that being said, we have been questioning, and this is a little bit of a Darwinist approach, but we've been questioning whether it's reasonable to accept that any club or association should be in a position financially or operationally to be forced to close permanently due to a season or less of downtime. A pandemic is not the only significant risk facing clubs, particularly here in Australia, where we've got sports grounds built in places where we can't build houses or shopping centres because they're old dump sites and floodplains. So clubs are often affected by floods and cyclones and bushfire, drought, and so on. And any one of these natural disasters could easily shut a club or an entire sporting precinct, for that matter, for a year or more. So we're conscious that some organisations have come into this crisis already in a pretty poor financial position, and that certainly presents challenges to that organisation's survival. And we'll come back to that a little later on in the session. But sport in Australia is huge business. Sport contributes typically around $13 billion to the Australian economy. And admittedly, lots of this money finds its way to commercial providers such as gyms or commercial indoor sports centres or resort golf courses and the like. But successful sporting clubs, even those which are not for-profit organisations, do understand that sport is business. And as we discuss ad nauseum in most of our training sessions with organisations, not-for-profit does not mean that an organisation is prohibited from making a profit. Not-for-profit simply means the organisation exists not for the profit of its members. So an organisation indeed should strive for a profitable operating situation from one year to the next so that they can continue to provide their services indefinitely into the future. Clubs that recognise that sport is business take control of their own financial destiny, and they don't rely on handouts from government or other sources to keep them afloat. So we reckon that the vast majority of clubs probably can get through this really challenging period. But the reality is that the crisis will be the death knell for some clubs, and that might include some of those organisations that came into this situation in a poor financial position. It might include some organisations that had other internal issues outside the realm of finances. So, warring factions within the club. Oh, shock, horror, politics in a sporting organisation, never. But maybe this is a really good opportunity for fear of getting some people offside in this discussion. Maybe this is a really good opportunity for those organisations that maybe their time has come, and maybe it's time for those organisations, probably such as those of you who've turned up to participate in this webinar, turned up digitally, to take some of that market share and to like I say, take control of your own financial destiny as a not-for-profit business. So this then brings me to my next point, which is to think big. When I first started doing this work in about 2004, and for quite a number of years thereafter, mind you, we at CPR Group and many others in the planning space focused on setting smart goals or smart objectives. And many of you will be familiar with this concept. It's to set goals that are specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, and time-bound. And this all means that we should know exactly what our goal relates to. We should be able to measure our progress against our target. Our club's leaders and wider membership should generally agree that the goal is where we want it, and the goal should have a deadline. But let's just focus for a moment on that R in the word SMART, which refers to setting realistic goals. And this is where we reckon that SMART goals fall short. If clubs only set goals that are realistic, the drawback is typically that they'll set those goals based on what is achievable with the skills and knowledge and resources that we have today. As an example, I was recently working with a rugby league club in Queensland on a training and planning project. And this club has about 270 active playing members. During one of our sessions, I asked whether the committee had aspirations to increase membership. And they said, yeah, we'd love to get our membership up to 300 within 3 years. That's a pretty realistic goal. They could probably achieve that increase with the same infrastructure they currently have and modest increases in coaching and other personnel. But realistically, the club probably just needs to not suck for 3 years and they would achieve an increase of 10 players net per year. So I challenged them and I said, well, why don't we aim to increase from 270 active playing members to 2,500 active playing members? And as you can imagine, this was met with quite a bit of resistance, and the committee started to tell me, well, they couldn't possibly achieve that growth with the fields they have and the coaches they have or the money they turn over. Naturally, they had started to uncover some of the limitations of today. But those limitations don't need to be the limitations of tomorrow. If that club leaves their goal at 2,500 members at 3, 5 or 10 years down the track, whatever the planning horizon is, that sort of number encourages the committee to start thinking differently about what they can do today to set them on a more exciting path. It's only by setting a goal that's not smart that they would consider options for facility expansion, securing more fields, maybe even looking into options for a satellite facility, introducing new and different forms of participation and even creative activities that could attract a different group of members altogether. So during this forced period of downtime, when everything is kind of already being thrown against the wall and moved around, challenge the decision makers in your club to think big. Some of the initial triage type activities to help mitigate impacts during the initial shutdown phase were discussed by Chris Kenwood during his webinar on the 1st of April, a couple of weeks ago. And if you missed that webinar, you can access it on our website. And Chris spoke about some of the steps in financial crisis management. We've got a 3-phase crisis assistance package that we're working through with some organisations, and those 3 phases very simply are shutdown, downtime, and reopen. And the shutdown phase for most organisations has now passed, and we're in this period of forced downtime. So those organisations, including those of you who are involved in this webinar, are obviously keen to capitalise on the opportunities that downtime presents. And further to the really important initial steps in what do we need to do to secure our cash, get it into the bank, if we can possibly sell some of our stock back to suppliers, maybe fire sale some booze or other items of stock in our clubhouse that have a shelf life. Once we've sorted through that stuff and we're then into this downtime consideration and making the best use of our downtime, it's a really good opportunity to talk about budgeting. The vast majority of organisations with which we work don't have a good budget. Most team sporting clubs, for example, have relatively consistent expenditure from one year to the next. So budgeting for an organisation like that is actually really easy to get started. But you might start to consider what's the club spending money on just because that's what you've always spent it on. Maybe there's some equipment lease arrangements that could be reviewed. Maybe you could be getting a better deal on your insurance. Should we put someone in charge of researching potential new suppliers for our playing jerseys? Because we all know that ordering process for playing jerseys between seasons is typically left to the last minute. It's rushed, and then particularly if something like coronavirus comes along, supply chains are interrupted and you've got kids starting the season without their playing strip. And what about income? This is also a really good opportunity to conduct a comprehensive review of your fees and charges. And you'll note that I emphasised comprehensive there. That doesn't just mean looking at what other clubs are charging. It means giving real thought to your core or primary income. So the stuff that people have to pay for to participate, to receive your core services. So putting kids on the field obviously costs money, and people have to pay for that. So the income on which you should be able to rely includes membership fees, maybe gate takings, coaching clinics if you run them, and so on. And ancillary income is all the stuff on which you shouldn't rely. So it's the bonus income, the cream on the top, if you like. So that might be sponsorship, canteen, bar income, fundraising initiatives. Grants aren't even in there. They're separate because they're project related. And we'll come to that very shortly. But this is a really important step that's often missed, because most sporting organisations cover their guaranteed expenditure. So there's income on which you can rely and income on which you shouldn't be relying. There's also expenditure that you know you're going to have, electricity, water rates, utilities and insurance and so on. And then there's ancillary expenditure. And that's typically stuff that relates to your ancillary income. So it might be cost of goods sold in your bar and canteen, cost of running fundraising activities and so on. Now, most organisations don't do this step in the process of splitting the ancillary and sport-related or core income and expenditure from one another, and determining how much of a shortfall there is between the primary income and primary expenditure, and therefore what they're making up in terms of their ancillary income. So we've got a budgeting tool that we're very happy to make available to anyone who's interested. If you want to include a note in the Q&A section, as Kate explained earlier on, that you're interested in getting a hold of a copy of that budgeting spreadsheet, we'll be really happy to email you through a copy tomorrow. It's a very easy to use tool that we recommend you simply copy data from your most recent audited financials into that spreadsheet, and it spits out a figure as to what the shortfall might be in your ancillary income and expenditure. So let us know if you want a copy. You could give thought to maybe some innovative event and fundraising ideas to complement, to implement once you're back up and running. I'm sure that people are going to be champing at the bit to get back out there and socialise. So get them to your club, get them involved socially in some activity that's going to generate some money for you. Really importantly, this is a very recent example for me. I'm working with a club that's had an ongoing issue for years with honorariums, and they have been trying to, and when I say an issue with honorariums, they're paying people who are volunteers, and some people are being paid tens of thousands of dollars through an honorarium type system, which is a real mess and presents real challenges to them in terms of potential claims. Well, look, I'm actually an employee. You should have been paying me super, and so on. So this is a great catalyst for them to be able to draw a line in the sand and say, sorry, the way we've been doing that whole honorarium thing has to change now. Obviously, no one's working at their club. No one's therefore being paid any type of income in bunny ears currently. And when they reopen at that club, they are going to take this opportunity to wipe out some of those old legacy systems that very much don't align with the principles of good governance. So think big about how you might be able to broaden your revenue streams, and don't confine your thinking to just your sporting activities. Look at what other revenue streams might exist out there. Strategic planning is something that clubs often talk about doing and don't do, which I find really funny. That we talk about, we should be planning for the future, but we're just going to talk about it and not actually do it. So in actual fact, they're already planning for the future by saying they should be planning for the future. Nevertheless, this is a really good opportunity for your organisation, if it has a strategic plan, to review it, and if it doesn't have one, to pull one together. a good plan should really answer three questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how do we get there? We typically aim for a 3-year planning horizon. We used to use a 5-year planning horizon in strategic plans that we were writing probably 10 or so years ago, and we realised that that makes it too easy to shelf the plan and ignore it for a few years. Whereas if it's a 3-year planning horizon, you're far more likely to be able to more accurately depict what the future situation might be in 3 years' time. So this can all happen online. You can run an online planning questionnaire for members to have input. You could even run an online planning workshop. Last week's webinar, we spoke about online meetings, and there are an abundance of tools out there for platforms rather for running online meetings and webinars such as this one. And sure, an online workshop is not as good as a face-to-face workshop. We get that. We thrive for personal contact and talking through issues in clubs and helping to find solutions collaboratively, and you're going to be limited in how effectively you can do that online, but it's nevertheless a really good opportunity to pull together a strategic plan. If you're interested in getting some guidance on how best to follow that strategic planning process, flick us a message in the Q&A box, and we'll be really happy to get in touch with you tomorrow to talk through how we can provide support. Same goes for constitutions. Kate's probably chuckling right now because every time I leave the office for a meeting with an organisation about a new constitution, I literally bound down the hallway. I love constitutions. Are you chuckling, Kate?
I am. And I love them too.
There you go. Kate has a legal background, so she probably loves them even more than I do. So these are some of the key components of a constitution. In every state and territory, incorporated associations are required to have a constitution. In some states, we call them rules. Public companies limited by guarantee that exist as legal entities under the Corporations Act are also required to have a constitution. And we recommend typically that a constitution should be at the highest level reasonable and should be supported by your bylaws and other policies. It's important to note that in Queensland, the Associations Incorporation Act that was originally enacted in 1981 and has been reviewed 6 times since then, most recently in 2007, which is quite some time ago now, is currently under review. So there was an amendment bill tabled in November last year, and a quick Google search, if you're interested, will take you to the Queensland Parliament website where you'll be able to find some information on that amendment bill. If you're nerdy like me and Kate, you can do that. If you would like us to send you the link to that, if you're interested, and the main changes there are things like registers of conflicts of interest for committee members and accountability for management committee members. So if you want to know more about that, let us know in the Q&A box and we'll be really happy to have a chat with you. So like I say, bylaws and policies then should be the more operational documents that support your constitution. And the process of updating these documents, the constitution, the bylaws and policies, is time consuming, and it's something that we certainly recommend should be enshrined in a healthy degree of consultation with your members. And for that reason, this is the sort of stuff that would need to happen using online tools currently, and we're currently working with organisations to follow these constitution review processes and writing new bylaws, all by correspondence and an online engagement. So it certainly can be done. And the reality is that it's not exciting for everybody. It takes time, and this is a great opportunity where people might have some time. You might be surprised at the number of people in your organisation that are champing at the bit to get involved in some valuable way in your organisation. They can't play golf, they can't play footy, they can't go and swim at the pool. These are people who might be, in some cases, at your club or premises, most days in a week, and that's been taken away from them. So if you put the call to arms out there, you might be surprised at the number of people that might be really keen to sit on a subcommittee to review the working from home policy, or to look in detail at the Constitution. When it comes to bylaws and policies, we say keep it as simple as you can. If your governing body has policies that you can refer to, just point to them. Don't duplicate policies just for the purpose of calling them your own. If you need to make changes, great, do so. If the governing body policies in any area don't suit your needs, and you can base them on those rather than reinventing the wheel. But if you can just say in your policy documentation, we abide by so-and-so national sporting organisations member protection policy, do that. Don't reinvent the wheel. We also love all things asset registers, and we have an online asset management tool called Asset Track, which I'll give you a little bit more info on at the end of this webinar. But the beauty of this downtime is that, again, preparing an asset register is a time-consuming process, and it ain't all that much fun, but it is a really important step in ensuring the longer-term availability of assets in good working order for your members and visitors. So, like I say, it's a bit of a pain in the butt to pull together an asset register, and for that reason, a lot of organisations that do have asset registers, those asset registers are out of date, and they include reference to assets that no longer exist at the club. But it's important to note that in some states and territories, it is a requirement of incorporation legislation that you have an asset register. So if this is something that you don't have, you should certainly give serious consideration to pulling that together. And eat an elephant one bite at a time. This is the sort of document that you can prepare over the course of months, literally, and there's never a greater opportunity than when your equipment and infrastructure is not in regular use. No better time to get down there and document what you've got. Risk management and disaster management plans in the sporting realm typically aren't all that complex. A good disaster management approach is known as PPRR, or Prevention, Preparedness, Response and Recovery. And most disaster management plans follow that format. Admittedly, we don't write a lot of disaster management plans for organisations. We do write a lot of risk management plans that have a disaster management slant. So risk management is all about the systematic identification of risks and establishment of strategies to either reduce the likelihood that a risk will occur, the severity of the outcome if a risk does occur, or both. And if you're interested in our sample risk management action tables, which is a pretty straightforward Microsoft Word document, let us know through the Q&A field, and we'll be happy to send that through to you via email as well. I mentioned grants briefly earlier. I've got a theory that there might be a bit of a downturn in the number of groups submitting applications, because a lot of clubs are going to be really heavily focused on other stuff at the moment. It might present a great opportunity for those of you who are on the ball to submit some funding applications for projects that you've been talking about for some time. Councils and state governments around the country have been releasing grant programs specifically targeted at providing support for clubs affected by this shutdown. So if you haven't already done so, certainly contact your local government authority and maybe state government Department of Sport and Recreation to ask what they're doing. Those that haven't yet released programs have said, we're working on it. Particularly in Queensland, obviously, we've got councils that have just been sworn in, so things in some cases are a little slower than elsewhere. This really excites me. There's a discussion that's been happening increasingly over the past few years about whether this federated model of organisations delivering sport in Australia is correct. So we've got national sporting organisations, they've got state sporting organisations affiliated with them. Then we've got regional associations affiliated with them, and then maybe even district and certainly grassroots club level organisations. That's a lot of legal entities. There's a lot of waste in that system. There's a lot of money, time, volunteer resources being chewed up that shouldn't be being chewed up. So we reckon that, and I'm a little maybe optimistic here, but we reckon that this crisis might be the catalyst that's necessary for some organisations to be forced into a situation where they more seriously consider going down this path of going from being, maybe a junior and senior rugby league club operating from the same facility, using the same field, using the same clubhouse, but still separate entities. Why? Because it's always been like that, or because the presidents don't get on. There's enough reasons, and sometimes I ask this question and organisations say, yeah, well, it's because of this, this and this. And I say, great, no worries. You've had a critical discussion about whether it's right for you and you've decided that it's not. So that's fine. The time's not right. But I've got to say, in the vast majority of cases, my opinion on this is that there's too much wastage, like I say, in the system. There are too many annual returns going to, state and territory offices of fair trading or consumer affairs. There's too many AGMs being held, too many volunteers, particularly in regional locations, that might be sitting on 2, 3 or 4 or more management committees because, all of the community organisation activities are delivered by separate entities. So I reckon that this could be this real challenging period financially and otherwise might be the push that some organisations need to consider this amalgamation or merge. We've done this to death. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this communication point. We've covered this in every one of our webinars in this series. It's of vital importance that you're keeping in contact with your members, you're keeping in contact with your governing bodies and passing information from them back on to your members. We know we've been getting a lot of questions about refunds and what we should do, and most organisations are putting themselves into a bit of a holding pattern there because they don't even know what their governing body is going to be doing in terms of offering refunds back down the line and so on. Keep in touch with, the reporting entity, whether it's the Office of Fair Trading or Consumer Affairs. If you can't have your AGM because you can't get people together, then whilst in Queensland, for example, the Office of Fair Trading has said everyone's just got a 6-month extension on their annual returns and therefore AGMs, still let them know that you're aware that that is going to need to happen when things go back to normal, or run an online AGM. Really importantly here, most organisations, as everyone on this webinar is going to know, have a small group of people, and we colloquially refer to them as the SEPs, or same 8 people, who do everything. They're the committee, they do all the doing, they do all the decision making. This is a great opportunity to get some new blood involved. People who, like I said earlier, might be really keen to help out in some valuable way. So put the call out to your members and let them know, look, we want to write a strategic plan. If you're interested in being on this subcommittee to take carriage of that, let us know. We want to review our constitution. We want to do a budgeting review. Create teams of people in your club that you can actively engage to do a really good job of this stuff, and just focus on that little area. And then ideally that will enable the management committee to focus on setting some of the strategies for what you're going to do once you're able to get the ball rolling, once the social restrictions are lifted. So I've seen some good questions coming in through the system. I'm going to throw back to Kate now. I knew this was going to happen. I said to Kate, look, we'll see how we're going for time. And if I've rambled, we're probably not going to get a lot of questions in. So I have rambled. And
we've got a lot of questions too. So I might just ask a couple, and then I'll email everyone tomorrow in relation to the other questions that we don't get to. Okay, so how regularly do we have to write a new constitution?
Okay, there is no legislated review period. Like I said earlier, the Act in Queensland was reviewed most recently in 2007. In most instances, in every state and territory where there is a model rules or template constitution provided to incorporated associations, that document will be updated when an act is reviewed. So I would suggest that at the minimum, if the legislation under which you're established is reviewed, you should definitely conduct a constitution review. You might not change anything, you probably will, but that's kind of the bare minimum. And as a rule of thumb, we say it really shouldn't go any longer than, say, 5 years between a good look through the Constitution to make sure that you're still operating according to the provisions of the document. But there is no statutory time frame. Good question.
Okay, another one is, what is the best tool for surveying our members?
Okay, we use a number of tools. Actually, we use SurveyMonkey. We use Google Forms. Google Forms is great. Anyone with a Gmail account gets access at no cost to a Google Drive account, and within that you can work on Google Docs or Google Sheets, which are Google's proprietary online word processing and spreadsheet tools. But you can also establish forms, and those forms can be collated and automatically create graphs and so on. So Google's a great free tool. SurveyMonkey is very powerful, and we've started using a suite from Zoho, which is through which we run our webinars, and they've got a survey tool in there. There are plenty out there, but my guidance here is always stick with the big players. Go with the ones that you know are going to continue to be there for the long haul.
All right. Do we need to have bylaws?
Oh, I love this question. We get this a lot. No, you don't. In no state or territory is it a requirement that an organisation has bylaws. However, organisations that don't have bylaws can often fall into the trap of including too much nitty-gritty detail in their constitution, and that means if they want to change any of that nitty-gritty detail, for example, the specific structure of their management committee, they then need to go through a constitution review process and submit that document that's been updated to their reporting authority. So we recommend that a constitution should be at the highest level that's reasonable and supported by operational bylaws, because if you want to change some operational provisions, you amend the bylaws and you don't need to go through the process of notifying the government entity. That's a good question, and one that we often get. Let's go with one more question.
All right. Okay. Our AGM should have happened this month. What should we do?
I think we've had this question during every webinar. It's a really good one, and because it keeps getting asked, I think it's a really good one for me to quickly cover off on. In Queensland, as I said, there's been an extension of 6 months, so you don't need to have your AGM within the statutory period, which is otherwise 6 months. For public companies, it's 5 months that you have following the end of your financial year within which you must have your AGM. So their first option is to either take the automatic extension that's been granted already in Queensland and possibly in some other states and territories, or apply for an extension to either ASIC or your relevant government entity, or run the meeting online. So you could use a tool like this, a webinar tool, to deliver an online AGM, and we're actually working with organisations to do that, doing all of the hard work behind the scenes and letting the entity get on with the job of running their AGM. And funnily enough, probably not a huge surprise to anybody, those organisations that are running online AGMs are having record turnouts because people don't have to actually turn up to the meeting. So that's another consideration as well. Very good questions. Thank you very much, Kate. Like Kate said, we will get back to any of your questions that we haven't been able to answer in this session via email tomorrow. And if it's something of a more complicated nature, we're really happy to have a chat over the phone as well. So if you wanted to do so, you could even whack your mobile number into the Q&A field, and we'll be able to give you a bell tomorrow. That then brings us to the end of this evening's webinar. This evening's session has been a lot about mindset, and that's really what we're all about at CPR Group. We spend a lot of our time challenging the way that volunteers, administrators, state and national sporting organisations and councils think about service delivery in the sport, recreation and not-for-profit sectors. And we really enjoy doing that. We love, as I said earlier, those aha moments, and really they only come from taking people outside of their comfort zones. So the Club Tags logo you see in the bottom left of that screen, that's our program through which we deliver tailored training to organisations like all of yours. Asset Track I mentioned earlier, and that's an asset maintenance, an asset register and preventative maintenance tool, and you can't put an asset into that system without assigning firstly an inspector to be responsible for monitoring its condition, and secondly, without inputting maintenance activities that are scheduled based on date. Meeting Track then, really excitingly, is our online meeting tool, which makes the preparation for and running of meetings far easier for your secretary. So we're offering free 6-month subscriptions to those tools, the Track apps, for anyone who comes along to one of these webinars. So if you're interested in getting onto those, again, the final thing that I'll ask you to do is to pop a note in the Q&A box, and also then go to assettrack.com.au to sign up for a free trial for Asset Track, and meetingtrack.com.au, and we'll be able to match up the comment that you've made in the Q&A box with your registration, and we'll activate a 6-month free trial. I really appreciate all of you turning up, and I'm sure that Kate does too, and we look forward to hopefully seeing all of you and more for our next webinar next week. If you're interested, as I said earlier, in accessing past recorded webinars, go to cprgroup.com.au/webinars, or click on the little tab up the top right of the home screen. And you can also register for upcoming webinars there as well. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.